I am Thomas, and welcome to another edition on this channel. We are right now over on the BQE, heading into the city. We'll be taking you into Greenwich Village. And as if you're not familiar, that is a neighborhood in Manhattan. It's actually right now, that building still stands. We're visiting a building in particular. It still stands. It's considered a part of NYU, which is a college. Here it is, the building, how it looked like back then. We're going into the time frame of 1911. It was referred, and that is the site of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. And it was considered one of the deadliest disasters in the history of New York City, and one of the deadliest in U.S. history. This fire caused the death of 146 garment workers. It was 123 women and girls and 23 men. Most of the victims were recent Italian or Jewish immigrant women and girls ages 14 to 23. Of the victims whose ages are known, the oldest victim was a 43-year-old woman, and the youngest was a 14-year-old. With two 14-year-olds. Hard to believe that this crime happened, close to, 115 years ago. It happened at 4:40 in the afternoon. Now, when we get there, the factory was located not on the whole building, but the factory was located on the 8th, the 9th, and the 10th floors of that building, which is called the Ash Building. Building was built in 1901, and it was later renamed the Brown Building. The address of the building, in case you guys want to visit it when we come in, when you visit the city, it's 2329 Washington Place. Again, it's near Washington Square, and it's considered part of the NYU, New York University campus. This 10-story building, it's on the northwest corner of Green Street and Washington Place. And then back then, and it was under the ownership of, we're looking at how the factory would have looked inside, the women and men and women at work, mostly women though. But the factory at that time was under the ownership of Max Blanks and Isaac Harris. And the factory, just as a little bit of a background, they produced women's blouses. Those were known as shirt waists back then. The factory now, normally between those three floors, had employed about 500 workers. And they were, again, mostly young Italian and Jewish immigrant women and girls. They had worked 9 hours a day on weekends, plus 7 hours on Saturday, just so you have an idea of how their work week consisted. Earning for their 52 hours of work between $7 and $12 a week. Now, if you're wondering what that would equate to today's money, well, It's the equivalent of about $229 to $392 a week. This is, using calculations as of, 2023. So on a per hour basis, that 229 to 392 would equate to about $4.77 to $8.17 per hour. The actual fire, which happened here, unfortunately, caused all these deaths. That started at 4:40 in the afternoon. We just passed the anniversary not too long ago. It was March 25th, 1911. The day was close to an end. As you see some of the newspaper headlines, at the time of this fire back in 1911. So, as the day was ending, a fire flared up in a scrap bin under one of the cutter's tables at the northeast corner of the 8th floor. Now, the first fire alarm was sent at 4:45 by a passerby on Washington Place, which was the street down below, who saw the smoke coming from the 8th floor. Both owners of the factory were in attendance and had invited their children to the factory on that afternoon. So the fire marshal concluded that the likely cause of the fire was the disposal of an unextinguished match or a cigarette butt that was placed in a scrap bin containing 2 months worth of cuttings, from when making the shirts, the cuttings, the leftover scraps. Beneath the table in the wooden bin were hundreds and hundreds of pounds of scraps left over from, several thousand shirtwaists that had been cut at the table. Now, the scraps they piled up from the last time the bin was emptied, coupled with the hanging fabrics that surrounded it, the steel trim was the only thing in that whole pile that was not highly flammable. Now you might say, was smoking banned back then? Yes, believe it or not, actually the smoking was banned in the factory. But the cutters, the people making the shirts, they were known to sneak cigarettes, exhaling the smoke through the lapels to avoid detection. Now, a New York Times article at the time suggested that the fire had been started by the engines running the sewing machines. Now, a series of articles in Coyers, which is another magazine, noted a pattern of arson among certain sectors of the garment industry whenever that particular product fell out of fashion or had excess inventory in order to collect insurance. Another magazine by the name of the Insurance Monitor, that was a leading industry journal at the time, observed that the shirtwaists had recently fallen out of fashion or had excess inventory. Backtrack. Insurance Monitor, that was industry journal at the time, said that the shirtwaists had recently fallen out of fashion and that the insurance for manufacturers of them was fairly saturated with moral hazard. Now, the factory owners, they were known for having 4 previous suspicious fires at their companies. But arson was not suspected in this case. Now, a bookkeeper, here we are at the Brown Building. We're reading the events as to what happened here if you visit. A bookkeeper on the 8th floor was able to warn employees on the 10th floor via telephone, but there was no audible alarm, no way to contact staff on the 9th floor. According to one of the survivors, this is the building here, how it looks like today. According to one of the survivors, the first warning of the fire on the 9th floor arrived at the same time as the fire itself. Now, the floor had a number of exits, including 2 freight elevators, a fire escape, and stairways down to Green Street and Washington Street. Flames prevented workers from descending to that Green Street stairway, and the door to the Washington Place stairway was locked to prevent theft by the workers. The locked doors allowed managers to check the women's purses. Various historians, they have also ascribed the exit doors being locked to management's wanting to keep out union organizers due to management anti-union bias. So you can see there are many theories left and right here after this fire, various conspiracy theories. Now, the foreman who held that stairway key door had already escaped by another route. Dozens of employees escaped the fire by going up the Green Street stairway to the roof. Other survivors were able to jam themselves into the elevators when they, at that point, was still continuing to operate. Within 3 minutes, the Green Street stairway had become unusable both directions. Now, the fire department, they had arrived quickly, but they were unable to stop the flames as their ladders were only long enough to reach as high as the 7th floor. The fallen bodies and falling victims also made it difficult for the fire department to approach the building. Imagine being just in this horrible situation with the fire, the flames, and that you feel that the only choice that you have is, just jumping through the window. And that in turn kind of made it hard for the firefighters to approach the building. You had elevator operators, Joseph Vito, Gaspar Mortorello, who saved many lives. They traveled 3 times up to the 9th floor for passengers. Gaspar was unfortunately, though, eventually forced to give up when the rails of his elevator buckled under the heat. Some victims, they managed to pry the elevator doors open and he jumped into the empty shaft. They tried to slide down the cables or to land on top of the car. The weight and impacts of these bodies warped the elevator car and made it impossible for Zito to make another attempt. William Gunn Shepard, a reporter at the tragedy, would say that, quote, he learned a new sound that day, a sound more horrible than the description can picture. The thud of a speeding living body on a stone sidewalk. So now, eventually, the factory's owners, Max and Isaac, they had to survive the fire, if you recall, by fleeing to the building's roof when it began. They were indicted on charges of first and second degree manslaughter in mid-April. And the trial began December 4th, 1911. The attorney, the counsel for the defendants, he managed to destroy the credibility of one of the survivors by asking her to repeat her testimony a number of times, which she did without altering key phrases. Now, the defense, they argued that, this witness and possibly other witnesses had memorized their statements and might have even been told what to say by the prosecutors. The prosecution had charged that the owners knew that the exit doors were locked at the time in question. Now, the investigation found that the locks were intended to be locked during working hours based on the findings from the fire. But the defense had stressed that the prosecution failed to prove that the owners knew that. The jury, they had acquitted the two men of first and second degree manslaughter, but they were found liable of wrongful death. This was during a civil suit in 1913, in which the plaintiffs were awarded the compensation in the amount of $75 per deceased victim. Rest in peace.